No one at Harvard expected anything unusual that day, until Barron Trump walked into the music classroom. A professor, proud of his so-called intellectual superiority, tried to humiliate him in front of everyone. Tensions exploded. All eyes were locked on them. But no one expected Barron's response to come through the piano and silence the entire room. The grand hall of Harvard's music department was unusually quiet that morning. Not because of silence but because of tension. Spring semester auditions were underway, and the university's elite music students were gathering for what many described as a tradition, a test, and sometimes, a battlefield. The room, bathed in pale winter light through the cathedral-like windows, held a strange mix of anxiety, ambition, and something else, expectation. When the door creaked open, no one looked up at first. But the moment his footsteps echoed across the polished wooden floor, eyes lifted, conversations paused. He was tall, calm, dressed in simple black, and carried himself with an almost old-fashioned discipline. But that wasn't what turned heads. It was the name on the list. Barron Trump. Whispers spread like ripples on still water. Wait, is that him? What's he doing here? Trump's kid, in music? Some smirked. Others raised eyebrows. A few simply stared, watching the son of one of the most polarizing political figures in modern history quietly take a seat in the back. They didn't see a young man who had studied classical piano since childhood. They didn't see the quiet hours spent away from the cameras, away from the noise. They only saw the name. And they judged it. One student in a leather jacket leaned toward her friend. This should be interesting. Her voice wasn't curious. It was sharpened with mockery. At the front of the room stood Professor Radcliffe, an institution at the university, and a vocal advocate for social consciousness in music. A brilliant composer, no doubt, but one known as much for his politics as his pedagogy. He taught that music must resist and reveal, that it was never neutral. Every note, every silence carried meaning. And today, he saw an opportunity. I see we have a rather notable name with us today, Radcliffe said as he glanced at the roster, his voice coated with polite venom. Mr. Trump, I trust your music speaks as clearly as your surname does. Some students laughed under their breath. A few looked away, uncomfortable. Barron didn't respond. He simply nodded, unfazed, and turned his gaze to the piano at the center of the room. No retort. No smirk. Just stillness. Radcliffe wasn't done. You'll be last today, Mr. Trump. I want to give the audience time to reflect. The professor smiled, but it wasn't friendly. As the other students played, some brilliantly, some nervously, Barron sat silently. His hands folded, his eyes watching the piano, not the performers. He didn't take notes. He didn't check his phone. He simply waited. There was a stillness about him. Not apathy, but calm precision. A storm held inside. The kind of silence that comes not from uncertainty, but from self-control. What no one in that room knew was that Barron wasn't there to prove anyone wrong. He wasn't there for applause. He wasn't even there to be heard. He came to do what he always did when the world got too loud. Sit, play, and let the music speak for itself. As the final audition slot approached, the room had begun to shift. A dozen students had performed, some confident, others visibly shaken, but all were received with polite encouragement. Yet the tension in the air thickened with every passing minute. Everyone knew who was up next. When Professor Radcliffe called out, "Mr. Trump, you're up," a ripple of anticipation ran through the room. Barron rose calmly from his seat, adjusted the cuffs of his black shirt, and walked toward the piano in measured steps. A few students readied their phones again. Others leaned forward, eager to witness what they assumed would be either a disaster or a political stunt. Radcliffe crossed his arms, lips pressed into a satisfied line. He had waited all morning for this. Barron didn't bow. He didn't acknowledge the crowd. He simply sat down. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then he played. Not with showmanship. Not with nervous energy. But with clarity. Intention. Precision. The opening notes, a hauntingly restrained prelude, drifted through the hall. His fingers moved with the ease of long-practiced memory, each phrase unfolding like a quiet confession. Some students straightened in their chairs. The chatter stopped. Radcliffe's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. Barron's performance shifted, almost imperceptibly, into a complex improvisation. Classical phrases gave way to modal jazz, followed by brief explosions of minimalist dissonance. At times it felt cinematic, other times raw. It wasn't just technical. It was emotional. Alive. He wasn't just playing a piece. He was speaking. Without words, Barron was telling them about every glance he'd endured that semester. Every whisper behind his back. Every assumption made before he opened his mouth. He spoke of restraint, of self-control, of never being allowed to make a mistake without it becoming a headline. And still, he played with grace. His posture remained still, but his hands told the story of someone carrying far more than notes. At the back of the room, one of the jury members whispered, "Who taught him this?" Radcliffe heard it, and for the first time his arms uncrossed. Barron's final movement was delicate, barely audible. He lingered on the last chord, letting it fade naturally, like breath leaving a room. Then, he gently lifted his hands from the keys. There was no instant applause. Instead, a long suspended silence filled the space. The kind that follows revelation, not performance. Eyes were wide. Jaws slightly parted. Some had tears forming without understanding why. Barron didn't wait for approval. He stood up, nodded to the instrument as if thanking it, and stepped away from the piano. Professor Radcliffe opened his mouth, perhaps to say something clever, perhaps to reclaim control, but nothing came out. His voice, like his assumptions, had vanished. The air still hadn't moved. Even after Barron had stepped away from the piano, the silence clung to the room like fog. It wasn't awkward or empty. It was heavy. Full. The kind of silence that comes when something sacred has just occurred. A few students exchanged glances, as if silently asking each other, "Did you feel that too?" Then came the first clap. Soft. Hesitant. Almost reverent. Another followed. And then another. Within seconds, the hall erupted into a standing ovation. Not the kind that's expected, but the kind that bursts from somewhere deep involuntary. Applause thundered through the room. Yet Barron wasn't there to hear it. He had already exited, calm as he entered. Professor Radcliffe stood frozen. His arms, now limp at his sides, refused to move. He had prepared himself for confrontation. He had even imagined clever remarks to use after the performance. But he hadn't prepared for this. Because what had happened wasn't just musical excellence. It was humility. Grace. Power that didn't need to raise its voice. And it dismantled everything he thought he knew about control. One of the jury members, an older composer with decades of experience, turned to Radcliffe. "You were wrong about him," she said quietly. Radcliffe blinked but said nothing. Outside, Barron walked alone across the stone courtyard, hands in his coat pockets. The cold Boston air nipped at his skin, but he barely noticed. His heart was calm. No adrenaline. No rush. Just stillness. He hadn't come to win. He had come to be heard, on his own terms. In the hours that followed, videos of his performance flooded social media. The Trump son who said nothing, and said everything. Barron's piano lesson for Harvard. No politics, just music. Thousands of comments poured in. Some still judged, but many had shifted. Didn't expect that. I owe this kid an apology. He earned that respect. The name Trump still stirred controversy. But for once, it was separated from noise and attached to art. Radcliffe, that same evening, sat alone in his office, the echo of the performance still bouncing off the walls of his mind. He played back the video, not to critique, but to understand. What he saw wasn't rebellion. It wasn't resistance. It was reflection. Barron hadn't fought back with words. He didn't need to. He had forced the room to stop assuming and start listening. And that, Radcliffe realized, was something no ideology could manufacture. The following week, a flyer appeared on the department bulletin board. Guest performance discussion. The role of identity in music. Featuring Barron Trump. It was signed, not by administration, but by Professor Radcliffe. If this story touched you, don't leave without hitting the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more true and powerful moments like this one. Your support helps us bring untold stories to life and reach more hearts. And tell us, what would you have done in Barron's place? Let us know in the comments below.